Our first presenter is Stephan Beckert. Stephan is the VP of Strategy for TeleGeography. He spent the last 15 years in the telecommunications arena focused on market research and in consulting practices. Prior to TeleGeography, he was the director of the wireless data services for the Strategist Group. He's coming on stage today to share his insights and discuss trends related to how the proliferation of mobile devices and the demand for increased mobile broadband has impacted the international traffic. In addition to his professional obligations and involvement in the telecommunications marketplace, he's a very involved member of the PTC. He's a member of our Board of Governors, and he's also the co-chair for the program, which has put together the great speakers we've had this entire week. Please join me in welcoming Stephan to the stage.
Thank you, Faye. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here. I know it's always challenging on Wednesday when you're kind of glazed over and dealing with the after effects of the Tapa and Coresight and Orange and everyone else's parties. When I was asked to speak at PTC this year, I couldn't really say no to Sharon, but also had to spend some time trying to think about how to relate our data to the theme of more fun of the new world. And well, to the theme of the new world. And I thought it would be fun to take a look at compare the world that was many years ago in telecom and compare it with the world we inhabit today and look at how things have changed. Turning first to the world of voice, then I'll move on to the world of internet backbones, and finally conclude with a look at trends in the international networks business. Back in the days of yore, in 1903, AT&T's financial report demonstrated that voice was at one point pretty much the best business in the world. To contradict John Rockefeller, who said the best run business in the world is an oil company, he probably had never looked at AT&T's financial results. In 1903, they had 65% net margins, and they paid out 80% of those margins as dividends. We're growing 25% annually. It stayed a good business for a long time, actually, after that. In the 1978, the year, if I recall correctly, of the first PTC, AT&T reported in their financial results that international voice grew 27%. And thanks to AT&T's frugality, investment in technology, they were able to only keep price increases down to just under 4% annually. Those days are obviously gone. These days, I think it's fair to say the voice business has matured in the 110 years since AT&T's 1903 report. The US began liberalizing its international voice market in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, markets around the world followed suit. And that resulted in very sharp price declines in markets in Europe, in North America, and then moving on to Asia. And that resulted, as you can see, in that sharp spike in traffic growth in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But as you move along the axis further to the right to 2013, you'll also see that growth rates are not what they used to be. Price declines that used to be could be offset by the volume growth. But in more recent years, as traffic growth has dropped into the single digits, it's become ever tighter and ever more difficult to maintain revenues. Some of the factors that are driving the declining growth rate of voice are pretty self-evident. I mean, most obviously, I think, is simply the fact that there are diminishing returns to price cuts. If you're cutting the price of international calling from $1 a minute to 50 cents a minute and then 10 cents a minute, you're going to see significant increases in demand and in volume. It may not offset the price declines, but it's certainly going to boost volume growth. But when you move from 2 cents a minute to 1.8 cents a minute, you're not going to get necessarily the same kind of customer response. The other factor that really has driven growth over the decades is the spread of mobile phones to emerging markets. As people in emerging markets got telephones, their relatives abroad, their migrant workers were able to call home. But at this point, virtually anybody who wants a phone has a phone, and the marginal effect of each incremental phone being added now on international traffic is pretty small. Of course, there's also these guys. knowing this audience, just show of hands, I'm curious, how many of you have more than 2 of these applications on your phone right now? 3? 4? How many of you recognize all the logos? These are all OTT companies that have, in the past couple of months, reached at least the 100 million download mark on the Google App Store. And obviously, that massively understates the user bases of many of these companies. And Google is not the only source for those applications. But it does give you a sense that they're certainly among the most widely used OTT applications. WeChat, I believe, has somewhere on the order of 300 million users at present. And just one of these companies, Skype, by our estimates, had about 214 million minutes of on-net cross-border traffic in 2013, an increase of about 36% from the previous year, which comes to 54 billion minutes volume increase in just 12 months. And in 2013, Skype's international traffic alone grew 50% more than the volume of all of the phone companies in the world combined. So the volume being moved by these guys is enormous. Even if they're not yet at the scale of Skype, collectively, they're going to have an impact. And that's been reflected in growth trends. This figure shows something of a what-if scenario. The line you probably recognize as the growth rate of international voice traffic, and the top line is what would happen to international traffic growth, international voice traffic growth, if Skype's traffic gains were added to increases in international long-distance volume. And as you can see, if you add Skype's traffic to the traffic of the phone companies, growth trends are much more in line with those historical trends that we've been seeing. Now, I'm not suggesting that Skype is to blame for all of the decline in voice traffic growth. I'm not trying to point fingers at anyone, and Skype certainly wishes phone companies no harm, since they make the vast majority of their money off of traffic terminated at the PSTN. But it's hard not to conclude that, given those enormous volumes, that some of that is coming at the expense of phone companies and has certainly been affecting growth rates. Now, the PSTN is not going to go away anytime soon. The biggest OTT application out there right now, Facebook, has, when I last checked, about 1.2 billion users globally. The PSTN has about 8 billion endpoints and keeps adding a few hundred million per year. So right now, there's no other network out there with the potential reach of the PSTN that could serve as a replacement for the PSTN. So I don't think anybody needs to lose sleep about it disappearing from one day to the next. But conditions in the market are going to keep getting more challenging. And as the international voice market is changing, we're also going to increasingly see divergences in carriers' strategies. When a rising tide stops lifting all boats, it may be time to switch to some other mode of transportation. You can see here some companies like Tata are orientating themselves towards growth, going for volume gains. Others, like Verizon, have chosen to start making a bit of a retreat from the voice market, only focusing on the routes where they feel they can make the margins they get, and deliberately allowing volumes to decline. And I think over the coming years, we'll increasingly see different carriers pursuing different strategies to figure out how to stay relevant in the voice market and how to maintain their margins, or perhaps to diversify or divest the voice business and move into other lines. Turning now to the internet. What you see here is the internet backbone in 1991. NSFNet had a nationwide T1 network, which even in 1991, it turns out, was a bit constrained. Within 1 year, NSFNet had been upgraded to a T3 network, a 30-fold increase between 1991 and 1992. Now, that's kind of overstating their growth rate because the T1 network had actually been deployed in '88. But even so, that's about 210% compounded growth. These days, we're no longer in the days of 210% compounded growth. Looking at international internet traffic growth rates, there was only one large regional market where traffic growth exceeded 41% in 2013. And 41% isn't necessarily a magic number, but it is the growth rate at which traffic doubles every 2 years. There were, of course, some sub-regional markets, the Middle East, Africa, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, where we did continue to see growth rates above the 41% level. But overall, growth rates have gradually been declining into the range of about 33% annually in recent years. So what's causing growth to slow? The primary driver of the slowdown is, in fact, video. Video is the primary driver of traffic growth globally, and as the internet becomes our replacement for the TV. But video traffic is also extremely cacheable, and video traffic has increasingly been moving to direct download sites, to streaming sites, and to other more legitimate means of acquisition. And as traffic has moved from P2P to those direct download and streaming sites, ever more of that content can be cached or distributed by CDN. So an ever smaller share of that traffic touches the backbone network. And that's why we're seeing these slowing traffic growth rates, because the primary driver of traffic growth doesn't necessarily need to cross the core network. It just hits the access network. Now, even so, it's important to keep in mind that the growth rates we're seeing are over 30% annually. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that the volumes are enormously larger than they were at one point. To go back to the earlier map I showed you, the Atlanta to Georgia link, the Atlanta to Washington, D.C. link on this map that in 1992 had 45 megabits per second of capacity, last year had about 1.9 terabits per second of capacity. So between 1992 and 2013, it grew 43,000-fold. And with those very large numbers, of course, it's hard to chalk up the same kinds of volume gains. Now, unlike the days of yore, telcos these days are not as readily able to raise their prices, not even just 4% annually. This figure tracks the price per meg of IP transit in 5 major markets around the world. And the percentage shows the rate of decline of IP transit prices in those markets. You can see, obviously, in the US and New York, in the US and in Europe, in major markets, IP transit these days is well under $1 meg for larger volumes. But it's not necessarily cheap in other markets around the world. There's still wide divergences in prices. Singapore is about 5 times higher than North America and Europe. Rio about 12 times higher, and in Kuala Lumpur, the price of IP transit is about 18 times higher. And if you look at the growth rates, you'll see they range from, well, the decline in prices, they're ranging from about 20% to about 30% in all of those markets. So prices are not converging. Those differences are persisting over time. And those price differences actually create an incentive for large content providers and larger ISPs to route traffic to other countries, for example, from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore to purchase upstream transit. And that in turn continues to drive demand for cable and network capacity. Turning now to the world of international networks. This is a map of the Eastern Telegraph's network in 1901. I love old network route maps. It's remarkable how much they actually parallel today's maps. But there is one difference. These days, most of the world is wired. It may not be as wired as people would like it to be, but by our estimates, and take them with a grain of salt, it can be hard to document everything exactly. By our estimates, there are at this point only 19 countries left in the world that aren't connected by some sort of cross-border fiber link, be it terrestrial or submarine. And those 19 countries have a combined population of less than 10 million. So if you're in the business of building greenfield subcable networks, Antarctica is the next big opportunity. Penguins need bandwidth. Now, that doesn't mean there's no subcable construction going on. There's still construction going on, but it's focused primarily on adding redundancy, supplier diversity, and to add route diversity as well, to reduce prices and to improve network resiliency. But there are very few networks these days that are going to be the first network landing in a given country. Submarine cable capacity in the past decade has grown enormously. from about 8 terabits per second on the routes shown here to 70 terabits per second in 2012. And we're currently updating our numbers for 2013. But that comes to about 25% compounded annually, and I expect we'll see comparable growth rates in the coming year. Most of that capacity increase has not come from new cable construction, though. It's come from increases in capacity on existing systems, by upgrades to existing systems, by lighting additional fiber, and by transitioning to higher bit rates. Between 2008 and 2012, on the routes shown here, carriers added about 30 terabits per second of new capacity. About 80% of that capacity came from upgrades to existing fiber. Even on the Trans-Pacific route, where the Unity, TPE, and AAG cables were deployed during those 4 years, about 70% of the gains in capacity came from upgrades to cables rather than from new cable deployments. And even though operators have been adding capacity, have been lighting additional capacity on their networks, it seems unlikely they're going to run out at any point soon. There was a period when you had to add, during the old days of the TAT cables, for example, as the cable ran out of capacity, you had to lay a new cable. And every 2 to 3 years, there'd be an announcement of TAT 5, TAT 6, as cables started filling up and as they had to start planning for the next new system. On the transatlantic route, though, at this point, we've added, during the past 7 years, 2005 to 2012, operators have added over 13 terabits per second of new lit capacity on the transatlantic route. But during that same time period, even though no new cables have been deployed, potential capacity on that route has fallen, the ratio of lit capacity to potential capacity has fallen from 24% to 14%. And I should add the estimates you see here of the ratio of lit to potential capacity on most of these routes just reflect 40 gigabit per second line rates. As more cables, particularly in the Trans-Pacific, are upgraded to 100 gigs, or as the engineering studies are conducted to figure out what kind of capacity they can handle at 100 gigs, we're going to see those ratios of lit to potential capacity probably continue to decline. We expect it to decline on most major routes in the current year. So essentially, there's no limit to how much capacity a cable can handle. Now, the rising lit capacity on fibers, on networks, and the increasing utilization rates on those cables are reducing the cost per megabit per second of capacity on those networks. As these costs come down, service providers, given the competitive nature of the market, are passing on those cost reductions in form of price declines. And if you look at the growth rate, this figure here again tracks prices on half a dozen major intercontinental routes and one US domestic route. And it also tracks the rate of price decline over the past 3 years. And you'll notice, not entirely coincidentally, that there are wide-ranging differences in cost of circuits around the world. And similarly, that the rates of price decline are pretty comparable to what we're seeing in IP transit price declines. And I don't think that's any great surprise, because the primary cost component of IP transit service, of course, is the cost of long-haul fiber, of the long-haul capacity needed to transport that traffic. So we're seeing these cost reductions coming, prices coming down around the world of lit capacity, and that in turn is bringing down IP transit prices. And that's really helping to enable the spread of OTT applications, bandwidth-intensive applications, and making it possible to continue providing affordable internet service to consumers. One interesting aspect also is that this figure here just tracks the rate of price declines of 10 gigabit per second wavelengths. And while the prices of individual bandwidth types of specific services, be it 10 gigabit wavelengths, 40 gig wavelengths, are declining at 20% or more annually, we need to keep in mind also that buyers are transitioning from smaller circuits to ever larger circuits. And the cost per megabit per second of a large circuit, of course, is significantly lower than that of a small circuit. So if you look at sort of the longer run trends and the implications for service providers, in in the early 2000s, the common bandwidth products used in the intra-Asian routes were STEM1s. These days, it's all 10 gigabit per second wavelengths. The cost per megabit per second of a 10 gig wavelength at this point is about 2% that of the cost per meg of a STEM1 in 23. Given those enormous price declines, revenue growth is challenging. We're projecting tremendous increases in bandwidth requirements over the next decade, but we're projecting only a 3% increase in revenue because prices are going to keep coming down and carriers, the big buyers of circuits, are going to keep transitioning to ever higher bit rates, bringing down the price per megabit per second of capacity purchased. But the good news, of course, is that there's no lack of demand for your products. And the other good news being 3% growth is better than many in the industry might have hoped for. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and wanted to remind you also that the new world is scary. Remember to bring a map, but also remember that maps keep changing, and that our concept and understanding of the world is also going to keep changing, and that geography keeps changing. Thanks very much for your time.